Hello everyone. It is 11:30, so feel free to keep trickling in, but we will kick off now. Thank you so much for coming to our panel, which is called A Feature Not a Glitch, the opportunities of game making in Australia. Before kicking off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge the more than 30,000-year history of art making, storytelling and creativity that this land's traditional owners, and encourage you to reflect on that in light of the art we're all lucky enough to make and support to make in the field of games. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So our panel today features people from various screen agencies, and we'll get to some introductions in a moment, but I just want to make clear sort of the tone of today's panel, because obviously we're all responsible for a wide variety of different funding programs, and there's definitely enough information about that in our brains that could take up a whole panel, but that information is available online. These QR codes lead to each of our games program landing pages, so you can read up on those there. We're all available all throughout the year to answer emails, to have chats about that sort of stuff. So the purpose of today's panel is not to answer really granular personal questions about funding. It's more to talk about the big picture of like, what's the purpose of a screen agency? Why do we even exist? And what's going on in the Australian landscape? Because we all have very unusual jobs that are, I guess, sort of akin to the perspective a games publisher has of the industry, where we're more looking at things from a collective, from a high level, looking at what are the patterns in games, and we know that that perspective has a lot of value, and it's a big responsibility to be the one seeing that perspective. So we want to take this chance to feed that perspective back to you and to answer questions you have about that. You know, we're all lucky enough to travel to a lot of the big events on the games calendar throughout the year, so we just want to feed some of that knowledge back out. So with that in mind, let's move on to some introductions. So I might just run through in seated order, and I'm going to ask everyone for their name, their pronouns, what their job title is, and to tell us an Australian game that moved you. So we'll kick off with Alex. I think they work, yeah, if you want to.
Hi, everyone.
I have to turn it on.
Turn it on. Just hold the line, please. Trying that. Beautiful. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Sangston. I am he, him, and am here from Muwinina country in Tasmania, island of Lutruwita. I represent Screen Tasmania. My job title is Executive Manager, and I'm a little older than most of the people in the room, so an Australian-made game that, what was the criteria? That moved me.
Or resonated.
Was Way of the Exploding Fist. Deep cut.
That's a hard act to follow after that. Hi everyone, I'm Lise Leitner. I'm the coordinator of Games and Interactive at VicScreen here in Melbourne. I'm super excited to see so many people here, and my pronouns are they, them. I had a really hard time picking just one, so I picked 25. No, but I did pick two. The first one that I picked in terms of emotionally moving me, I think is maybe a bit out of the ordinary, but I picked Ring of Pain because I love card games, and the owl in Ring of Pain emotionally moved me in the sense that when I play it late at night, I sleep with the lights on. So. And then the second one that I wanted to give a shout out to is Queer Man Peering into a Rock Pool. It's such a beautiful story about belonging, relationships, and so yeah, if you haven't played it yet, absolutely worth picking up. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Mark Smith, he, him, from Screenwest, so digital games manager over in WA. And an Australian game that moved me was probably a bit more of a recent one, but it would be Hollow Knight. I think just the level of quality and polish in that game, and recognising it came from an Australian studio, it's just super awesome to see that, so yeah.
I've got my own.
Oh, okay.
Are these working too? Can you hand through this?
Sounds like it.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Pat Webb from South Australian Film Corporation. I'm he, him. Game that moved me is I'm thinking necrobarista for this one, for emotional movement. It was not one I expected because it's not sort of a genre I traditionally go into, but I actually picked it up the first time I got an iPad and it really stuck with me for a while. But I'm still holding out for a really Australian Souls-like, so if anyone's developing something like that, please get in touch. Thanks.
Hey, I'm Jed Dawson, he, him, the head of games at Screen Queensland. This was the hardest question. I ended up going with Heavenly Bodies, just because I had such a good time playing with some friends. I can't remember the last time I literally cried laughing playing a game, so that moved me a lot. Although, if we're allowed to do two, the second one is Fruit Ninja. I love Fruit Ninja.
Amazing, and way to just rep Queensland in the last minute there. Well done, Jed. Oh, and I'm Amelia. It's on the board. I probably don't need to say that. She, her. I'm at Screen Australia, Games Investment Manager. And I don't know if moved is the right word, but when I first got to play Gubbins, I was supposed to be playing it for assessment and I ended up playing it on this plane ride for 3 hours because I just couldn't stop playing it. So shout out to Gubbins as that game. So we're going to start with a few prepared questions to sort of kick things off. But as you can see on the slide, we're using a digital tool to take questions. This doesn't require any downloads. You just open your browser, put that URL in. You can submit questions, and if you keep it open, you should also be able to see questions other people have submitted and upvote them if you think it's interesting and you want to see it answered. So we're going to start with some prepared questions just to set the tone, because I know asking the first question can be really intimidating. But please, while we're talking, if there's something we're talking about and you want to hear more about that thing, chuck your question in there, and then when we get through the prepared questions, we'll move on to the submitted ones. So yeah, this is really an AMA. We're just going to be sort of firing questions to the panelists and having a chat, more casual. So yeah, please feel free to put your questions to us, and let us know if you intend it for someone in particular as well. And you can do it anonymously. So if you're shy and you wouldn't normally ask a question, I challenge you, please do ask us a question. So I'm going to start with a really easy question. What is the purpose of a screen agency? Maybe I'll just hand to Alex first.
Sure. A screen agency, it's a harder question than you think, isn't it? Pretty much what our job is to spend government money, really. It's that simple. Spending, in our case, our state government money for whatever reasons the government wants to do that. In terms of games development from a Tassie perspective, it's largely aimed at tech and innovation and hopefully jobs and dollars, but our sector is a little bit more emergent than a lot of the others. So yeah, it's very much about taking government priorities and pushing them through the mechanism of whatever sector you're working in, and in this case, the screen sector. I reckon that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, beautiful. Does anyone else want to jump in off that? Lisa? Or...
I'm happy to take it. But we have a mic off. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. I love that you put the easiest one first. I think from my perspective, I think a lot of the things that people think of when they think of a screen agency is project funding. But from a VicScreen perspective, we do so much more. We have industry development initiatives. We support people to travel to Gamescom, to GDC. We support initiatives on the ground in a local context. And in that sense, I think a screen agency is so well placed to really have a holistic view of the sector and support people in different places to make the projects that they want to make and tell the stories that they want to tell. And I don't know about everyone else here, but that's one of the parts that I love most about my job, that you get to see so many people at so many different levels just doing amazing things, and just want to keep building on that.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, and I think the word holistic that you touched on there is really key, because I think that in terms of all those programs you're talking about, what we see from the screen agency's perspective is those gaps, because that's really where a lot of our programs will go, is when a gap is identified. For example, a challenge that Australians face more than maybe people in the Northern Hemisphere is travel and things surrounding that. And so, there can be a tendency in games to be extremely Americo-centric, I suppose, but it is important to keep in mind we do have unique challenges here, and that's, I think, yeah, sort of where we play. But Jed, did you want to?
No, are we going down the?
You guys are all taking turns so nicely. Go on, Mark.
Yeah, so from like a Western Australian perspective, the travel part is definitely a big focus of us as well. Obviously, being geographically far away from a lot of events, even this event here today, we were able to support some of our practitioners to fly over, and I guess my focus has always been like, we know that we have the talent in WA and in Australia as a whole. It's just getting the right eyes on it so that those projects can be seen by the world and really recognised for the talent that we have here. So building the infrastructure to get those studios off the ground and get those projects out there, and just let the games speak for themselves as much as we can.
Love that.
You take that one. I'll take that one. I don't want to.
We're so good at this.
I just want to echo what everyone said. I agree with all of that. One other thing I also really like about our position is that we also can speak to government. So, I don't know if anyone's ever seen a minister play a game, but it is hilarious. And being able to show the government what our industry does, sort of on our own turf, so to speak, is a really unique opportunity that our sort of roles allow us.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We often see ministers on the news or whatever talking about the importance of tech or emerging technologies or whatever, but I think, what's rewarding about our roles is being at that intersection and actually able to shove it under their noses sometimes and be like, hey, look at this cool thing happening right here.
Yeah, on that topic, it's I jokingly describe my job as performing an elaborate heist for the games industry. And it differs depending on what state you're in and where your industry is at. VicScreen has been doing this for ages. A lot of the other states are sort of at a stage where they're more doing advocacy to government, so convincing the government why it's a thing that should be supported. Really dependent on the state, and again, identifying the needs and what we can do. It differs state to state and where the industry's at and what it needs.
Definitely. And I mean, that's the value of being at something like this as well, is just getting to talk to so many people at once and understand more what those gaps are. Staying with that theme of travel as well. So historically, many Australian game makers travel to GDC in the US, Gamescom in Europe. These are considered sort of the crown jewel of industry events throughout the year. But we are starting to see a lot more events in the post-COVID era in the Asia Pacific. So there's obviously the Japanese events coming back, like Tokyo Game Show, Bit Summit, Level Up KL just happened a week ago. There's Gamescom Asia in Singapore. WA Games Week just kicked off for its inaugural year. We had Sage in SA in March, which was an awesome showcase of games as well. So my question with all of that in mind is, what opportunities do you think these sort of more Asia Pacific focused events present for Australians?
I think I'll go first in that from a WA perspective, in terms of our time zone aligning really well with some of those Southeast Asian companies. I think there's some collaboration there that could be really beneficial for our industry. So being able to travel to some of those events and talk to some of those companies to see areas in which we can sort of work together. I mean, obviously we want to try and make sure that there's lots of jobs and positions for people to work in Australia and in Western Australia, but there is some collaboration with some of those other studios that I think being able to go to those events is, opens up that networking and those relationships, because we can make games remotely as well, you know. So I guess building that network is super important.
That is definitely a unique benefit of this industry, and something that I think people are really shocked when they find out how, I guess, adept a lot of game studios already were at remote work in the post-remote work era. But Jed, you look ready to go.
Yeah, so I mean, we partner all the states to do delegations to Gamescom and GDC. Those delegations take different forms, but generally it's like getting a group together and going to a place for a mission, and coming together as a group has all of these benefits like support, learning from other people, asking for advice. I think we're at a stage where the industry kind of knows what to do at Gamescom and GDC. So, and I really see a lot of potential for a delegation, particularly around like overcoming cultural barriers and language barriers, where actually going as a group could be a lot more beneficial compared to going to places where our cultures and language are pretty similar. So I'm really keen to explore that space. And, you know, ultimately, studios go over there and they're like, well, what's the return on investment? It's a lot of money to travel. If we can get the same return from a smaller investment, why wouldn't we do that?
I think, that's very husky. I'm going to roll with it. Yeah. I think to build off what you said, Jed, I would interrogate like different events a little bit, because like depending on where you go, it depends on your project, what outcomes you have, what you're looking for. If you want to like connect with different audiences, if you want to expand your network, if you're looking for commercial opportunities, all of that will sort of inform what events are right for you. So I think the fact that broadly there's more diversity in those events is a really good thing for people to look for different perspectives onto their creative practice and then expand that in a commercial sense as well. So I think that's a super, super positive thing. And I think more broadly, just like the barriers and arriving somewhere where you're not like jet lagged to your eyeballs would be fantastic. So yeah, highly recommend that as well. But
Awesome.
Dittoing what everybody else has said, but I also wouldn't. I don't think you can ignore the fact that supporting devs to go to those major conferences costs us a lot of money. Like, it's quite expensive for us all to support you guys to go to those sort of things. So anything to bring those costs down is fantastic, because it means we can send more people for the same budget. So sending people to an Asia Pacific based event would be fantastic from my point of view.
Awesome. So moving on. So the importance of video games culturally is often conflated as economic importance, with impressive stats about the global annual revenue of games being a really popular way to sort of justify the cultural worth of video games. But economic and cultural worth are two different things. So the question I would ask of you guys is, why are games worth paying attention to beyond their economic impact? We've seen in the National Cultural Policy, you know, through arts funding, games have been acknowledged. So yeah, I guess just reflecting on, what is that cultural worth beyond those economic numbers that get thrown around? Easy questions, all really easy.
I think the unique thing about games compared to other medium is the interactivity part of it. So I think in terms of representing unrepresented or underrepresented voices, having people engage in a game and have that interactive component where they're experiencing it themselves, I think offers a really unique experience. And I think that's super important, especially for stories from underrepresented groups. I think the difficult part is that when in our job, when convincing governments to supply money, is that economic side can become sort of like a KPI for that of what's the return going to be, and it's where it's not just about money, but the money needs to be there first in order to fund it to then get those cultural outcomes. So I think we're getting there, and I think the states that have been doing it for a bit longer, I think, are in a better position now where they can fund those games that are not necessarily there for an economic impact, but for the cultural impact, and that's awesome to see. And I hope that we're able to keep doing that in all of the other states as well.
I do also think those two things kind of can tie together pretty neatly. I mean, Australia makes some very out there games and some very unique games. Like, we have a really distinct voice. New Zealand too, and like around the world, like this is a global audience, and they see something that's very different from what they see being developed in their, in other regions, and showing sort of our the unique Australian voice that we have really can lend to commercial as well. Like, it doesn't have to, but it can.
That's a good point.
Yeah, great. I'm going to start mixing it up with the questions from the audience because we are starting to get some great questions in. And this one is very relevant to this question that you've just been asked, which is, where do you see the line between commercial and artistic in your funding decisions? I'm happy to start. No, you can go for it, Alex.
They're the same thing. We don't, certainly from our point of view, we don't necessarily differentiate between creativity or art and economic return. They're just two different ways of looking at a project. And we'd always assess them both, but not favour one over the other. Some projects are more commercially based, some are more artistic and creative. And they're both wonderful ways to tell stories. So, yeah.
Anyone else?
I would echo that. I'm gonna be that guy, but like our assessment criteria are really helpful for that. We look at the cultural value that a project will generate, as well as like the commercial outcomes. And when we have a project go to panel, we look at both of those angles. So I think it's worth bringing that lens to bear, because not every project is the same. And if we were creating projects that had like a very set, rigid commercial outcome, then we would be doing things differently. So, but to echo Pat's point, I think the voice of Australia and the games that are being made here are so unique and so interesting. So it is definitely worth us bringing that cultural lens to bear and recognising that, yes, we give people funding, but we're also in the business of storytelling, of helping people create the stories that they want to see and supporting them in that way. And I think to something that you said earlier, like we have a different risk profile to publishers. So when it comes to that cultural value and people taking more risks, like I think we are uniquely placed to support that as well.
No, definitely. And I think something that you said, Mark, about agencies being in the game for longer, like you can see that in some of the programs VicScreen's able to offer, like Originate Games was a fund that you guys just did specifically about experimentation, and you can see now with Screen Oz, when we were doing the expansion pack, we really noticed like having a one-size-fits-all fund comes with a lot of challenges because people are trying to do really different things with the funding, which is one of the reasons we split it out into something that is more friendly to experimentation creatively and something that can be commercial or creatively focused.
Can I follow up on that, Amelia?
Yeah,
Thank
please.
you. I think that's a really important thing to keep an eye on, is that when we are looking at a game, all of us, we will always be much more accepting of risk and much more accepting of people trying to do different things, because if the market was going to support it to more money, you wouldn't need to talk to us. So we are almost always the funder of last resort, and that's why we're more more happy with risk friendly. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Might move on. So this is a fantastic question. How have you found advocating for games in a traditionally film screen sector, and what do you hope to see in the next few years for Aussie games and games funding? And this is interesting because everybody's sort of at different stages here. And I will say as well that Screen Canberra and Territory do have some games funding since Screen Oz came into the picture through existing funds. So it really is kind of like everyone at a different stage of the journey. But yeah, did anyone want to kick off with their experience with that?
I've found that the film industry's been helping it a tiny bit. I mean, The Last of Us being a hit was huge because gives us something to talk about in the office with our co-workers, and we're like, did you know this was actually a video game? They're like, what, like a shooter? And it's like, yeah, but it has story. And they're like, what? So that sort of stuff has helped as we've seen better video game movies and games.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, starting at Screenwest, that had previously, we had a pilot program for games, but it hadn't been integrated fully into our business yet. There was a lot of language that was based around film and TV, and it was definitely heard from the industry that was kind of a barrier or a bit of a, something that wasn't favoured from the industry. So part of my job coming in is I wanted to change a lot of that language and rewrite a lot of our documentation to be games focused, because there's definitely some areas where there's a crossover of some of the language, but then there's other areas that are just completely different. So so we do our best, I guess, to try and make sure that everything is in line with the games industry first. But with that in mind, it's built off of a lot of infrastructure and paperwork and documentation that has come from the screen space. So there's always improvements there, and we're working on it.
Yeah, cool. I'm particularly interested to hear from you, Jed, because I did see the announcement that you guys just got a $5 million boost. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Which I'm sure was which I'm sure was the result of lots of advocating.
Yeah.
So
it feels like interpreting a lot of the time, and it goes to like a very fundamental level. You know, even the way that we report to Treasury or Department of Premier and Cabinet. Film and TV have been doing this for a long time. They've got a shared language with government. So the way they talk about jobs, for instance. So the film and TV industry, they'll be like, "We've got this project coming through. It's 300 jobs," and I'm like, "I got 20, but they're different." And so how do you explain that? And it's not. It gets even more difficult. Like, it's easy to say, sure, they're full-time jobs closer to the tech industry. Yours are, it's hard, you have to be really diplomatic about it, and you be like, yours are part-time contract gig work. But and then there's another part where that spend happens immediately and you can measure it right away. So you have to be like, look, these companies or these projects that we're kicking off is like a 10-year, 5-year thing, and it's just a completely foreign thing to the experts in film and TV at screen agencies. So yeah, it extends beyond Screen Queensland into broader government, which helps sometimes because it's a really big push for tech startups happening in Queensland at the moment. So yeah, that's what I've found.
excellent. Anyone else? Yep.
I spoke here at GCAP a few years ago. I think it was 2019 on that, and the question was basically the same, except at that point it was Screen Australia wasn't in the business, the DGTO didn't exist, and I think I said something like the game sector needs to find its hard hats, which it kind of did. And what I meant by that was every politician loves a photo op, and they all like to put on the high vis, and they all like to hold a shovel. It's a really good visual, and they love to do it. So you've just got to find the equivalent of that. And that's a bit of a throwaway line, but I mean it honestly. It's always about, as Jed said, it's about interpretation. It's about finding what it is about this sector or the work that you do that aligns with what the government wants. And that could be anything. In my case, I quite often pitch it as this is the greenest industry you could possibly have. Tassie's power is entirely renewable. And that's really the only carbon footprint in the game sector. So, and that resonates with our government because the Tasmanian brand, which is literally this, is very much around clean and green. So it very much becomes that you've got to find what your point of difference is and what's going to make them interested enough to pay attention. And once they start paying attention, then the numbers make sense. But it's only once they're paying attention to the sector that the numbers work. The other point I would make is that sometimes these things take a long time. I began my career at what was then the Department of Communications, Information Technology and the Arts in Canberra. And I remember writing a cabinet submission about advocating for a games offset in 2006. That's how long we've all been doing it. And if Ron's in the room, he'll nod vociferously because he's been doing it for even longer than that. It can take time, but often there's just a moment where something happens and then everyone gets pulled along. The states in particular don't like to be left behind. The number of times I'm briefing a minister where it'll just be, hey, you know what Victoria's just done? Or, you know what Queensland's just... 5 million, did you hear? That really makes them pay attention.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. I guess following up from that, one question that we've got from the audience is what protocols are in place to empower and protect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people I guess, in our programs. And I think this is relevant because in the National Cultural Policy Revive, there was 5 pillars, and the first one is First Nations first. So it's clear that this is, the government is putting, like the federal government is putting huge focus on this. And as you said, that does tend to trickle down and set a lot of tone. I know for Screen Australia, we have our First Nations department, which has been doing work to empower film and TV First Nations practitioners for 30 years. So, and we really see, what's beautiful is that you see the results of that after it's been going for 30 years. Coming into games, obviously we've got those challenges with the film and TV knowledge and that gap, but we have, we have a lot of support because of that. So, we're taking small steps at a time, but doing the First Nations Game Studio Fund last year was a really exciting start to that space. But I think for Screen Oz and games in particular, we're only just at the beginning. But for the agency in general, we do have a whole team of First Nations people, and we put in all our guidelines that they can speak to our First Nations team first if that's more of a way in to speaking about funding. So do we want to take this one by one, or you want to start, Jed?
Sure. It's hard, and again, we always reflect on the protocols and expectations that the screen agent, like the film and TV department, has set up, but there's a lot more First Nations people in film and TV than there is in games. So it's a balancing act between, how can we support projects, but at the same time making the eligibility criteria realistic for our industry. So it's like a simple thing where it's like this is an example, 75% of the creative team needs to be First Nations if it's a First Nations game. And then there's, intellectual property and making sure that that's all sorted out. But 75% might be really like almost impossible for an industry that's as emerging as ours to achieve. So what's that negotiation look like? Because you could have someone who's really like an Aboriginal developer who really wants to make their game, but they need a couple of artists, but they just can't find the appropriate artists that we decide.
I think this is a good point, and like at Screenos, we sort of have the advantage of that national purview and being able to link people up who are doing those emerging things in different states and bring them together. But yeah, it can be hard when you've got one person who really wants to do the thing, but the way the guidelines are written makes it hard for them to get there. So that's definitely something to reflect on.
Yep.
Anyone else?
So from Screenwest, we don't have the same sort of 75% at least for games specifically, but the way that we try and make sure that that those stories are still told in the right way is we have a First Nations department as well. So anything that, whether it's a First Nations story or a First Nations practitioner, that will immediately go through that department's door to make sure that everyone's doing the right things and the right voices are being heard. And the same as with diversity and inclusivity as well. We have another department for that. So we want to make sure that, if there are any stories being told from underrepresented groups, whether that's, through culturally or where you're from or other backgrounds, that's being treated in a way to make sure that that's authentic voices. So we do make an effort to make sure that can happen. Even though we are a really small team, we still have sort of teams for that, which I'm really glad that we're able to do even with a small amount of people.
Yeah, awesome. Lisa?
Did you want to go, Pat?
Yeah, I'll go quickly. I just wanted to sort of echo that. We have a similar process. We have our First Nations executive and departments for those kind of things around. And I suppose that also comes down under the sort of educational aspect of the games overall. Like those executives are traditionally from a film background, so we connect them with our Indigenous developers, and also just generally around the office, like showing them games that are made and things like that. Sort of that helps build up that dynamic between the team, so that we can work together in those kind of scenarios.
Yeah, and I think building on what everyone here has said, like there's so much work left to be done in that space, that we're constantly having that conversation internally as well. And one of the things that we have in our assessment criteria at the moment is if you're telling a story about someone from a diverse background or you have First Nations content in your project, you need people with lived experience on your team to tell that story, and to have people there who are the right person to tell that story and not appropriate it. And also I think from a process level, if there is like a project that comes through with us, like having someone from the appropriate background to assess it as well, someone who understands like the nuances of someone's lived experience is massive. But yeah, definitely a lot left to be done in that space, in games for sure.
They're all issues that I wish I had. And this is quite a sad thing to say, but I have never had a discussion with a Tasmanian Aboriginal person about game development. They're just not there. I'm sure they are there, but they've never spoken to us. And this is there's an awful lot of intergenerational trauma in the Tasmanian Aboriginal population, and we're only really starting to break that down on the film and TV side, or to work through that on the film and TV side. In the visual arts, it's much better. But we will get there.
Yeah, and I think more and more is happening. Like it's good to see, sort of examples coming to the fore more, and yeah, it's sort of like Lisa said, there's so much to be done, so let's get out there and do it. So sort of staying with that theme of like, I guess, more emerging groups of game makers, this question is about people working in remote areas. So the question is, what advice can you give developers who reside in more remote areas of Australia in accessing resources, and is there any focus on supporting those developers who are more regional? And certainly, reflecting on that, that's been one of the most tricky parts, I think, coming into Screen Australia doing this. And we've been, a team of 2 and now a team of 3 for 18 months. And, games is fantastic because it is online, and it's sort of a lot of the resources and the engines and stuff are democratised. Anyone can get started anywhere. But I've certainly had a lot of conversations with regional developers who, once they get past that like bedroom game making, how do you take that next step of connecting with other game makers? We've had some great positives come out of this. I guess one thing that reflects on this is just the importance of digital and physical events. We had one developer in far north Queensland who was able to team up with some people from the NT and make something together, and that's just because they met through a Discord that was about game development. So there's certainly things like that starting to happen as it's more visible that people are making games no matter where they are. But anyway, I'll throw to the panel if anyone had any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I mean, in South Australia, we actually have a community Discord. Before I worked in the Screen Agency, I was one of the admins of that Discord. And I think we have about 1,000 people on there now. And sort of anytime there's events, like we talk to TAFE in their regional area education and some of the universities and things like that. And we encourage them all just to join that Discord. And we sometimes host online events, in-person events where we can. And, people can reach out to a Screen Agency on Discord, which feels weird to say, but that's how we do things.
I mean, we have a great Discord as well from a volunteer-led organisation called Let's Make Games in Western Australia. And people will often reach out through that as well. And with WA being such a large state as well, we do have a lot of remote developers, but it thankfully hasn't had that much impact. There's some games that we've funded that I was able to only in person meet the developers not long ago after having so many emails and Zoom meetings and funding their games, and then only meeting them in person sort of at the end of that. And also with our travel funding as well, we offer an extra incentive for regional areas as well. So on top of the existing travel funding that we have, I think it's an extra $500 that we're able to put onto flights for people in regional areas.
So logistically, somebody can get to Perth so that they can then get to the other place.
Yeah,
that's awesome. That's great.
So I'm happy that we have that because our state is so large that we can't just. and again, also with events as well, we try and any time that we're having an in-person event, we always make an effort to make sure that there's a camera there, there's a live stream, people can interact on their phones, because we know that, you know, access geographically is a challenge for some people, and we don't want to cut them out of the equation. There's still probably more work we could do in that area, but yeah, we're doing what we can.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's so building on that, it's very much like a difficult part of our job is getting applications from people. You know, there's plenty of people in Brisbane who are very practiced at applying funding. They're plugged into the programs. They're always applying for the rounds. Every project, they're like on it. Much like when we started the games program, you know, technically a lot of our game studios were eligible for funding, but because they were filled with film language, we didn't get any applications because people didn't think like it was for them. So why would they bother with the effort to fill out an application? So a lot of it is really trying to not make everyone think that we're Screen Brisbane. So yeah, like echoing that, it's very much having specific language, having specific programs, so that, yeah, those people in Far North Queensland, regional Queensland, do feel like it's for them and they're just as eligible. They're in with a shot. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think something interesting for me since starting this job is that we do a roadshow with Screeners, or we have historically, and we'll go to different capital cities around Australia to meet people, but they're always in capital cities. And I often wonder, like, you know, what else could we achieve by getting out there, or even like on your state-based level, you know, organising something with you guys to be like, let's go to this other hub and let's, like, you know, I don't know, food for thought, let's chat later. Did anyone else have any follow-up on that, or I might move on? Lisa, yep.
I was just going to add, like, for us, it's really baked into our assessment criteria. Again, like, we have a assessment criterion called Benefits to Victoria, where we actually look at, like, the Victorian context explicitly, not just Melbourne. And I think one of the impacts of COVID as well that's been really beneficial is that we have so many meetings online now. So it doesn't matter where you are in the state. We're happy to talk to you. And when we talk to people from regional areas, we also make a real effort to connect them up with Discord groups and that sort of thing. And so often you do see people who are like, I was on a Discord, I met someone on the other side of the world, and we're making quirky games now. And I think facilitating that and making that an explicit possibility, like, I grew up in Belgium, which is basically like the tiniest country in the world, like a postage stamp on planet Earth. So I think knowing the possibility that you can go out there, you can connect with people on a global level and make something, just have someone make that explicit to you as a pathway is valuable. So for us, when we talk to people in more regional areas, that's something we always have in our mind, to just say, like, you can do this, our funding is for you, like, it's Victoria, it's not just Melbourne. So that's, really important.
I think that's actually one that's easier in games than it is in film and TV. We've actually funded almost as many games based out of Launceston than we do out of Hobart, and the game sector is just much better at connecting with us. We often get people in Launceston complain that we're not around much and don't fund. Launceston's the smaller of the two major cities in Tassie. That we don't fund enough stuff out of Launceston, but the game sector just goes ahead and does it, and they're great, and I love it, and it's fantastic.
Amazing. This may be a little bit of a spicy one to ask at Melbourne Games Week, but the question I think is valid, which is, what are your thoughts about how Melbourne-centric the discourse is in International Games Week? Is there ever interstate struggle with being heard higher up? Yeah, I suppose this means in government and, like, the dominance of the industry in Melbourne and how that sort of affects, you know, whether there would be belief that there are developers in other states and, you know, why should we fund them? That sort of challenge in speaking to government.
VicScreen have been leading this for 30 years, I think. Yep. And it makes my job easier. Particularly when I'm trying to explain to my boss why we should do a program. I could be throwing all of these business cases at her, but, like, if I'm like, well, VicScreen does it, it gets through. So yeah, honestly, you deserve to have centre stage after all of the work that you've done. Saying that, it would be nice if you came and visited me in Brisbane every now and then. Yeah, or I would love to come and visit Perth or Adelaide, Darwin, all the cool cities. Yeah, I don't know, but you deserve it, honestly.
Yeah, I think, similar to what Jed said, like Victoria has been, an example of how well it can work. So we're always just like, that's why we don't have the numbers that they have, because we haven't had the same government support for as long. So it's just a perfect example of, look what Vic's doing, can we do that too, please?
Yeah, I definitely have chatted with people about the brain drain, I guess, that happens in other capital cities when Melbourne has so many opportunities that, it makes sense and that investment does make sense. But definitely a lot of conversations happening. It kind of happens on two scales, right? There's like the state-based brain drain when people chase jobs, but there's also the Australia brain drain of people going overseas. And I'm just like riffing now with my own question, but we are now seeing, we've got Playside has I think over 200 people now. We've got Gameloft Brisbane sort of growing. We've got Tantalus Keywords. There's all of this sort of more AAA and more moneyed presence coming back to Australia and sort of stimulating different areas with jobs. I'm interested if any of you are seeing an effect of that, if you're seeing, I guess, people having better opportunities in their different states, that having an effect on the ecosystem.
I'll go on that because it flows on really nicely from the last question. Almost half of my devs are working on games out of remotely, Tasmania.
Yeah,
they're working remotely.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you, VicScreen in particular. That's a really interesting one because it's having some weird impacts. And I probably should have given a heads up to the people on the panel that I'm going to speak about here, but I won't reveal which. It's not going to be hard to figure out who it is. So one of the states offers a PDV rebate. And I was contacted by one of our devs that was going to be working remotely for a studio in that state, but didn't get the job because their salary wouldn't be covered by the rebate. So that question about brain drain, it has some really interesting impacts. But broadly speaking, I mean, we all work together incredibly closely. We all get along like a house on fire. We're always happy to help each other out.
I think we've seen a bit of a shift in our ecosystem, like having those bigger studios come in. We were sort of like a one big studio town for a while, and now that's sort of spreading to be a few different studios, so there's different opportunities. But on top of that, we had the sort of what we call the Hollow Knight effect, where everyone had that dream of being the next one. And now we're seeing sort of a shift where people can sort of choose whether they want to go into that larger industry, or they can still follow that indie dream, or they can, work somewhere for a while and then move into that. And I think the result of that is that we're seeing more need for local showcases as well as sending people over to Melbourne for Games Week and things like that.
It sounds like people have more choices and opportunities now, which is maybe a good thing, because it did kind of feel for a while there like you just had to make an indie studio or get a job at one. So nice to see that diversity.
I think one thing I would add with the addition of bigger studios is when we set up Originate, one of the things that we explicitly wanted to include is that people if they had worked in a AAA context for a while and they wanted to come out and make something weird and quirky, they could come in for Originate. So it's also thinking about that broader cycle of growth and how the ebb and flow of talent into studios and out to studios works. And I think we're starting to see some really positive effects of that, and that's really exciting to see. But yeah, I feel like I'm the old representative of VicScreen, being we've been here for 30 years.
Go home, Grandma. No, we love to have you here. Anyone else, or we can move on to next question. So changing tone a bit to the sort of submissions that we see, I think this is a good question. When screening submissions, have you seen an oversaturation of certain game formats? And if so, what are the pitfalls of those applications that can be avoided? And I'm just going to take the mic for a second to answer that because I feel very passionately about this. So a common misconception that we see a lot is this idea that Screen Australia government funding can be used to jump on a hot trend in games. I think a great example recently has been Vampire Survivors, is just like so popular and they made so much money so quickly. But it's just one example amongst many, you know, like every 6 months there's sort of some other game that breaks out really big and people want to emulate that success. And what I say to those people trying to emulate those successes is that unless you have like a huge promotion budget, so you can get your game, like you can basically get the other game out of the person's hands and get your one to replace it, which takes a lot of money to advertise and promote to that. That's probably best left to those really big companies with that budget to do that. And you've really got to come back to the fact that something like Screen Australia funding, it's arts funding, it comes from the arts department. We're really looking to, you know, we're not trade, we're not Austrade. There's maybe other things across government that can help you if you're really like going from like a business and commercial, you know, let's jump on this trend perspective. But I know for Screen Australia, the things that do well are the things that sort of come from a place of real authenticity in sort of like the creative journey that you're on and your own practice as like a studio in what you're trying to achieve. But yes, I'm sure everyone has seen trends of this nature.
Yeah, I mean, definitely trends in genres. And so, like, it's actually a real treat being able to see from such a high level perspective what developers are thinking, you know, like all the frog games, the crab games.
Yeah, and there's like a people in SA trying to make Hollow Knight. That's definitely a thing as well. Yeah. I'm sure you see that as well, Pat. But we get a lot of SA apps like that.
It's not necessarily, you know, I love frogs, so. But yeah, my main advice to studios or applicants. That I can give really briefly without knowing anything about what you're making is like, don't ask for pennies. You know, I would rather, don't come in being like, oh, I'm asking for like half of what I actually need, because I hope that'll make my application more competitive.
Classic.
Yeah, we like that just increases the risk because I know that it's not enough money. I mean,
well said.
The grants we have is never enough money, but it just increases the risk profile for it because I know that you run out of money and then you'll get a new job and then the project will just end. So that's my really, really quick advice that can apply to everyone, I think.
Yeah, I think we tell people a similar thing, ask for what you need. And if you think about the game that you want to make, think about where you are now. If you get the funding, where it will help you go and how the funding will help you get there. So basically showing that you have a plan in place, you know your risks. We understand, like I've worked in game development as a writer for many years, so like there's not a lot of money in there. So now I work for government. But it's not necessarily about doing a pitch where you sort of gloss over those risks, but just showing that you know what those risks are, and if one of those risks manifests itself throughout development, you can show we've thought about this, like we have help in place, we have a person in place who has particular experience that can help mitigate that risk. And I think from a creative perspective, like we've definitely seen the Vampire Survivor clones come through as well, and one of the most interesting pieces of advice that I've always heard as a creator is like, if something huge comes through, like a Vampire Survivors or a Lord of the Rings or whatever it may be, the next version of that will make such a huge impact will be completely different, and that is the point of it. So I think if you have a creative vision, don't stick too much worth by trends and what's doing well at the time. I think if you look at the Australian ecosystem, like we make weird crab games and they're amazing. So if you have an idea that has that authenticity and you know what your risks are, then yeah, absolutely come talk to us and lean into that confidence with your creative vision.
Following from that, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that when you're thinking about that question of risk, we're going to see a lot of it anyway in your application, and so being honest about that is really important, particularly because from an assessment point of view, the way you are addressing that risk says a lot about the capacity of you as a developer and therefore the quality of the application. So don't ever see a flaw in your project as a problem. It's a problem to be solved. And the way you're going to solve it is the important bit. That's the bit that we want to get at, because we're after developing you as a developer and as a company. What is it about crabs and frogs and geese? Well, yeah.
I love that, Alex, that the optimism in that statement of it's not a problem, it's a problem to be solved.
I mean, game developers are problem solvers,
That's what I was about to say.
So,
I was
yeah.
like, that's all making a game is solving a problem. So.
The other thing I'll say as well, I know the question was about trends, but when we're on the topic of things we're looking for in applications as well, is read the criteria, because that's what it will be assessed on, and call ahead if you have any questions. I think that's the one thing that I'm still trying to convince our developers is that there are a few problems that could come up that could be solved or mitigated if they called ahead and we were able to work that out and manage that risk. So
definitely. I think one of the biggest challenges of working at a screen agency is like you're set up from the get-go as this the word government is attached to your title, and so people hear government and it's like bureaucracy and big and scary and your taxes and it's like awful, but we're just people working for government, and that's been probably the biggest challenge of my job, is to just get out there and try to humanize myself, because I've had feedback from really new developers who have since gotten our funding that they never would have applied if I hadn't flown to Perth and talked to them in person. So we definitely encourage anyone with questions to approach us. We've probably only got time for one more question, which I might end with this weirdly optimistic question. But before that, I will just answer someone else's question very quickly. They've asked if there's any current or future plans for game dev support for the ACT or the NT. I can tell you that if you go on the Arts ACT website, they do some games funding, and also for Screen Territory, they support games funding now. They have travel funding as well, and I can introduce whoever asked this question, if you do live in that state, to the right person who runs that funding. Feel free to email ScreenOz if you don't know who to talk to at your territory, and we can just connect you up, or any of us. We all know each other. So just talk to us and we connect you up to those people. There's also a bunch of developers here from the NT that just gave a talk before, so there's stuff happening there. It's exciting. But to move on to the final question, when are we creating state/federal games agencies and shedding film baggage? I guess the question is like, do you think that will happen? What would it take for that to happen? Is that a good idea? Your thoughts on that?
I think it's a great idea. I'd love for it to happen. I think we're, particularly from a WA perspective, we're still in the early stages of, getting the games funding just from the start. So, but, here's to dreaming about it, I guess. Yeah. Anyone else?
Okay. ScreenTas isn't actually an agency. ScreenTas is 5 people in the Department of State Growth, so it won't happen for us. But I think there's a commonality. They're different. We all know they're different, film and TV and games, but it's still about storytelling on screen. Mm-hmm. There's still really good linkages between them. And on the other side of it is, if it's not us doing it, you're building something really new, which is risky. If you have a games funding agency, an agency is easily cut by government. Yeah. It's easy to remove a function if it's an organisation. Having games funding within an existing screen agency that has a long history, it sort of insulates it a little bit. And so, because this is what Screen Australia did. They just funded stuff and looked after it. And thank God VicScreen was around just keeping us all alive for those decades. Thanks, Caro. But I just point out it is somewhat ironic that at the entire time they were doing that, they're called Film Victoria.
I think it's nice having adult supervision. It's just the film and TV people have been doing it for so long. They've learned all the things. It's nice going to their premieres as well. And we don't have enough games premieres.
Launch parties, yeah.
Yeah, and ultimately it reduces the costs of the agency overall. Like we share marketing people, we share lawyers. Like it's efficient. It's frustrating sometimes when you have to explain to your boss what an Xbox is, but it's worth it, I think.
Yeah, I think it shouldn't be understated. The benefits that are there as well from leaning on and leveraging the skills and the knowledge in the film and TV area. So as much as I'd love for us to be our own thing that's separate, in the meantime, when it's, while we're together, might as well leverage those resources and, talk about ways in which there's cross-pollination of skills in the industry. So we can sort of use the fact that we're, grouped together as a benefit for now. And I think there is a huge benefit there, and not to, ignore that as well.
I think it's...
Oh, you go.
Sorry. A bit of a spicy question for me, but I'll gloss past that right now. But we have not just film and TV, but there's also a lot of the VFX industry and online and things like that. There's a lot of cross-industry development that we see. I've worked with VFX developers that have moved into games and then back into VFX and that kind of thing, and we see a lot of that as well. So I do think it's quite nice to have that sort of link between, and as you said, storytelling as well. Writers can move from film to games and back again, and at the end of the day, it's all going digital and it's all going to be online.
I think that was beautifully stated, and you stole a lot of what I was going to say there. Just kidding. I think for us, doing a rebrand from Film Victoria to VicScreen, the response to that has been so positive from a games perspective. People seeing themselves more represented in that word screen, and so I do think there are huge benefits to bringing them together and to learning from each other, and we will see where it goes. But I think leaning on Film Victoria, VicScreen's 30-year-long legacy, we've seen our funding change so much based on what industry needed. So if those needs change, then maybe the agencies will change too. But for now, it's been really beneficial seeing that response in Victoria from a screen perspective.
We've got to wrap up soon.
Sorry, one more
good.
very quick thing. Netflix's interactive movies, they are games,
And
really.
they do games now as well.
Yeah, and they do games as well.
Getting all over it.
They're two sides of the same coin, I think.
Yeah. No, definitely. Okay, we're a little bit over. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks to our wonderful panellists. Hope you have a great GCAP.